Well, hello everyone. Well, thank you for the invitation to speak on this subject. It's an honour and it's unusual because the topic of resource allocation systems has not been something people have been talking about until very recently, and so I'm very happy to revisit where the idea really came from, um, what we've learned about resource allocation systems and where perhaps resource allocation systems can help us going forwards. Um, and so this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about how rationing works generally, why why there is value in a resource allocation system to tell people their budget up front, um, why we don't need to have really complicated systems of assessment to make resource allocation systems work, and what I think we should be doing to make these systems more local. So there's a lot of interesting questions to tackle when we think about budgets, resource allocation, fairness, social justice, um, lots of things people can disagree about. But I think there is a sense in which there's a positive development over time from systems of exclusion to institutional placement to the language of care packages and to the more modern idea that people should be in control of their own lives, should be entitled to support, and that means entitled to control the budget that funds their support. So that seems to me the right framing for the modern world, for what we know is right for disabled people, for inclusion, for the kind of communities we want to create together. It doesn't answer every problem. It doesn't tackle questions of is there enough funding in the system? It doesn't necessarily lead to all sorts of other kinds of justice and fairness. And all of these systems, whenever we create them, already sit in bigger systems that can either support them or attack them. So we know all of this. And the last 15 years of austerity teaches us that we can't be too optimistic about the intentions of government um, in the current political environment. But nevertheless, there is a strong case for wanting to identify a fair and reasonable budget. When originally I presented this idea, well, I started thinking about it in the mid 90s because when you start thinking about individualized funding, you are faced with this problem of how do you identify the right amount of funding and when do you identify it? And there were competing ideas, but it seemed to me both looking at some of the literature, but also just learning from personal experience that usually there is great advantages to knowing what your budget is upfront so that the allocation can drive more creative planning. That was the original idea. And as I started to work with local authorities, first in Scotland and later in England, um, I think I first called this idea an indicative resource allocation, which has a rather unfortunate acronym. And then this became the resource allocation system, the RAS. I always think there's a danger, isn't there, when we have this kind of heavy duty jargon. It's there partially to make people feel more comfortable because it makes things sound more serious. But of course, there's a danger that that's actually a little bit of smoke and mirrors. And over time, I think that the resource allocation system started to turn from a helpful tool into an unhelpful, phony technology. The basic idea, and I lived this in the late 90s, working in Glasgow, getting people out of institutions. The basic idea is if you help people know what their budget is, if you help people think about what options are available, you're much more likely to get better support solutions that help people create the kind of lives they need, the kind of lives they want, that help people make use of their real wealth. And I think this is a key issue why having flexible funding, which is really the same as kind of having a resource allocation, I think these issues are closely linked. I mean, in a sense, if even if you use a very cumbersome method or a very controlling method like timings, like working out how many hours of support should somebody should have, defining the pay rate they should use, multiplying those to give people a budget. If people have freedom in how they use that budget, then you've just done a resource allocation system, haven't you? You've just kind of gone around the back of the houses to do it. What we try to do is do it up front and not do it by defining the service solution first. But if you do use the service solution first and you then give people flexibility, really that's a kind of resource allocation system. And it's a reasonable one in the circumstances of people's ordinary situation. If people are already in services, one very crude thing to do is tell people how much that service costs. At least when you've got individual services. When you've got group services, then you need to break up those groups and then you need to attend to needs in a slightly different way, which is also kind of less complicated than it might seem. But the idea here is that this money is being used by people so that they can build on their natural gifts, their relationships, their place in community, and their own resources. We created some very simple systems to begin the ball rolling within Control in 2003, based on work that I'd done in Glasgow. The core model we used had levels, and while we wandered away from that later on in late 2000s, I still think that this model is the best, and it was a mistake to create overly complicated, overly sophisticated models. Because basically, we know that um, impairments, disability, complexity varies along the normal curve. So there are a lot of people with some disability, fewer people with significant disabilities, and even fewer with really complex disabilities. And we know that, roughly speaking, costs will go up in kind of an inverse proportion to those numbers. So in line with this kind of graphic here. And actually, this kind of fairly simple set of levels, however you set them, is probably more than adequate to deal with the complexity that people need, especially if you use the kind of indicative principle that people are told what their budget is. They're trying to plan with that. Most people will work successfully within their budget. Some people will come back and say it wasn't enough. Some people say it was too much. Actually, we found more people came back and said it was too much than was not enough. But either way, that kind of spirit of trust and clarity and transparency is very helpful in creating good support solutions that don't assume that we already know what people need. In the future, I think um, we will need to start thinking about these things at a different level. At the moment, there are still people, I think, who dream of taking the whole care system up to a national level and creating some very, um, very large, I mean, it would have to encompass 1 million people probably, kind of million people and a kind of independent living fund with assessors probably running from London or somewhere, coming in and giving people budgets. That kind of national care service meets independent living fund is certainly one positive idea, but I don't think it's the right way forward. I think what's better to start thinking about resource allocation as being pooled at a neighbourhood level. I think if you, at a neighbourhood level, about 150 people with significant disabilities, and then other people who currently probably wouldn't meet any care threshold, but certainly need support from each other and from the community. Well, that kind of group is a, a large enough group for actual to have a neighbourhood budget, which you can assume will probably be adequate for everybody's needs in that budget. And at that kind of level, a small group of people, including probably people with disabilities, should be able to make reasonable judgments about how to distribute those funds fairly and adequately. Um, So that might seem quite radical, but certainly that's where my head is at the moment. We need to try and get closer to communities, not further away. There's lots more to discuss, and this is a QR code which would take you to the resource allocation system um, papers and things that are on the Citizen Network website. A few years ago, I did apologize for allowing the creation, when I led in control, of these complex resource allocation systems. And I do want to kind of underline the importance of that apology to me, just in the sense of the recognition that I had over time that what we'd really done by making the system more complicated is we had empowered bureaucrats um, over frontline social workers and disabled people. We were solving a non-existent problem, which was the need for the system to ration the resources with more and more complexity further and further away from people. What I think I've learned through my personal experience and also by looking at some possible solutions, some of this is written up in the papers you can find, is that a more human scale approach with sensible judgments around using practical levels that we know from experience are currently in play. It's not like it's a mystery how we're spending the money now. Um, is perfectly adequate to empower people to have better lives and not to leave professionals and people with disabilities at the mercy of the bureaucratic system.